The hissing noise came without warning. Private Shigeru Matsuda flinched as the strange metal box on the table let out a sharp, rattling hiss. Steam burst from its spout, curling into the cold air of the barracks like a ghost. All at once, laughter erupted around him. Quick, brash, startled laughter that bounced off the thin wooden walls and ceiling beams of the long sleeping quarters. A dozen Japanese POWs surrounded the table, their breath visible in the morning chill, pointing at the contraption like children mocking a street performer. "What is that thing?" one soldier barked in Japanese, jabbing a finger at the box. "It's a demon." "It breathes smoke," another howled, doubling over, clutching his sides in exaggerated glee. "Lightning water," someone muttered. "They boil water with lightning now." The others roared. One bold young man, lanky and missing 2 front teeth, leaned forward and tapped the side of the box. The laughter turned to a yelp as he jerked his hand back, waving it in the air. "Hot!" he shouted, eyes wide. That only fueled the frenzy. Several more leaned in closer, poking and circling the object like it might sprout legs and walk. Their tattered uniforms rustled as they jostled for a better look, the coarse fabric still stiff from salt and dirt, their boots leaving damp smudges on the barrack floor. Some were fresh from island captures, others from long sea transfers. None had seen anything like this. Shigeru stood a step back, arms crossed tightly over his thin chest. His eyes narrowed as he studied the device. A coiled black cord snaked out the back and disappeared into a socket embedded in the wall. A small switch blinked faintly red. The water inside had boiled, fast. No fire, no fuel, no visible heating element, just metal, electricity, and silence until the hiss. Nearby, a German POW, tall, blond, his posture stiff with old discipline, sat calmly at the table, stirring tea with a bent spoon. Steam curled above his tin mug as if nothing unusual had happened. He didn't even glance at the commotion around him. His uniform, still bearing a faded Wehrmacht patch, looked cleaner, pressed. His hands didn't tremble from hunger. Shigeru turned his gaze back to the kettle. "You laugh like children," the German said, his English slow but clear. He didn't look up. A few Japanese soldiers paused, frowning. Most didn't understand, but Shigeru caught enough. He also caught the tone, disdain, mild and effortless. The German sipped his tea, then looked up with pale blue eyes that showed no interest in explaining further. "Do you know how it works?" Shigeru asked him in halting English, stepping forward. The German blinked, then smirked. "You put in water. Plug in cord. Wait. Then tea." He gave a small shrug and returned to his drink. Shigeru stared down at the kettle again. His fingers itched to lift the lid, to peer inside, to find what made it boil so fast. It wasn't magic. It couldn't be. But it was fast. Too fast. He'd grown up boiling water over charcoal or stoves. Even aboard transport ships, heat had meant flame. This was something else. It gnawed at him. But even more than the kettle, it was the laughter around him that disturbed him. "They believe boiling water with lightning makes it clean," someone shouted behind him, mimicking the German's accent. More laughter followed. The officers, 2 stern-faced lieutenants from the camp's surrender negotiations, stood by the entrance of the barrack watching the scene with tight mouths. One of them finally spoke. "Enough," Lieutenant Hoshino said. "It's just a teapot. Westerners make everything loud and wasteful. Return to your bunks." Grumbling, the crowd dispersed. The kettle gave another faint hiss as the switch clicked off. The silence afterward felt louder than the laughter had been. Shigeru returned to his cot, but he didn't lie down. He sat upright, staring at the wall across from him, his brow furrowed. In his mind, he tried to picture the inside of the kettle. Coils, tubes, electric filaments like the old lamps in Tokyo. He glanced at the German again, who had left his empty mug on the table and was now leafing through a tattered German-language newspaper from weeks ago. His indifference stung more than any insult. "Does he think we're fools?" Shigeru whispered to himself. A breeze rattled the window pane. Dust floated in a sunbeam crossing the floor, catching on the threadbare blanket at the foot of his bed. Later that day, Red Cross inspectors walked the grounds. They moved slowly, clipboards in hand, flanked by 2 American guards in thick jackets. One of them smiled politely as he passed the Japanese barracks, glancing inside briefly before scribbling something down. Smooth integration of Axis nationalities, his report would later read. No mention of the mockery. No note of the divide between the Germans' comfort and the Japanese skepticism. No record of the Kettle. Just numbers and conditions. Metrics and politeness. Back inside, Shigeru watched as the Kettle was unplugged and stored in a corner cabinet. He thought about asking to see it again, but something held him back. He realized no one else in the room was thinking about the Kettle anymore. To them, it had been a punchline, a moment of absurdity in a world they didn't control. But to Shigeru, it was a question that lingered like smoke, curling into the corners of his mind, refusing to dissipate. They had laughed, all of them, loud, dismissive, unified in their scorn. But as he sat there, hands resting on his knees, spine straight, eyes locked on the cabinet that now hid the humming silver device, one thought came back to him, sharp as frost in the Arkansas air. We laughed not because we understood it, but because we didn't. Sergeant Tomohei Arai burned his fingers. It happened in an instant. He had reached toward the humming kettle without thinking, his fingertips brushing the warm outer shell before instinct recoiled his hand. He cursed softly, not in pain, but in embarrassment. The others hadn't noticed, thankfully. Around him, the low murmur of prisoners readying for bed rolled through the barracks. Blankets rustled, cots creaked. Somewhere in the corner, a German POW snored faintly beneath a scratchy Red Cross-issued blanket. But Arai stood still, hand clutched to his chest, as if the warmth had scalded something deeper than skin. He returned to his bunk without a word. Once seated, he slid out the stub of a pencil he kept hidden inside the hollowed base of a toothbrush and reached beneath his mattress for the small, cloth-bound notebook he dared only open under darkness. He flipped past pages of circuit sketches and warship layouts until he reached the blank space he'd left that morning, the memory of the Kettle still vivid. He began sketching. Rough shapes, a base, circular, coils, he guessed copper, some kind of resistance loop. Heating element integrated directly into the water chamber, he murmured under his breath, drawing a squiggly line that symbolized electric current. He paused to listen, footsteps outside. Boots crunching gravel. The guard? He snapped the notebook shut and slipped it under the loose floorboard beneath his cot, heart thudding. The bunk above him groaned as Private Nishida rolled over, muttering something in his sleep. Arai stared upward, his eyes tracing the slats between beams. He wasn't sure which burned more, his fingertips or his pride. Earlier that day, he had stood quietly behind a group of younger prisoners laughing at the Kettle again. One mimicked the exaggerated buzz it made when it clicked on. Another joked that it was a metal demon boiling spirits. Even the German prisoners smirked, though none corrected them. Arai had said nothing, but he'd watched. Closely. He had recognized something they didn't. Efficiency. In his Yokohama workshop before the war, he had spent months refining boiler systems for Navy vessels, trying to find ways to conserve coal, improve transfer speed. And yet, with all that engineering, none of it had produced something so small, so simple. An American kettle, boiling water in under a minute without fire, coal, or the hiss of pressure valves. Why hadn't they made this in Japan? He remembered asking his supervisor once about consumer applications. Could a scaled-down system serve homes? The man had laughed. "No time for tea dreams," he'd said. "Only what serves war." Arai hadn't asked again. And now here he was, boiling with resentment while holding back awe for a kettle meant to serve tea to captives. In the dim light, Arai thought of his father's words, long ago. Mastery isn't knowing how to build something big, it's knowing how to make it small without losing power. He heard voices outside the barracks. A flashlight beam swept past the window. He froze, not from fear of guards, but of informants. Rumors had spread that some prisoners were reporting others, reporting curiosity, the kind that sniffed too long at American tools or asked too many questions about electric systems. "If you care more about their machines than our flag," one soldier had whispered last week, "maybe you should stay here." Arai waited in silence until the light faded. Then he slid the floorboard up again, retrieved the notebook, and returned to his drawing. He adjusted the coil pattern, added a resistance symbol, crossed out an earlier guess. This wasn't just about heat anymore. It was about shame. Not defeat in war, but the realization that an entire branch of innovation had been overlooked, dismissed. And for what? To prove they didn't need luxury? That comfort was weakness. The door opened suddenly. A chill wind swept through. It was Lieutenant Sakamoto. He nodded curtly at the men still awake, his expression unreadable. Arai tucked the notebook away without making eye contact. Sakamoto moved to the front of the barracks, speaking to no one in particular. "Lights out. 10 minutes." Then he turned and paused. His eyes landed on the kettle. Still plugged in, still humming. "You'd think," he said slowly, "a prison wouldn't need such indulgences." He stared at it a second longer, then left. Arai waited until the door closed again. Then he knelt, carefully replacing the floorboard. He sat back on his cot, listening to the gentle rumble of the kettle one last time. He didn't know if the sketch he made would ever be built, or if he'd even be allowed to carry it out of this place. But in that moment, he felt something shift inside him. Not anger, not reverence, something sharper, a reckoning. And in the notebook, beneath the circuit, he had written a single line, circled in pencil. "Sometimes the greatest shame isn't defeat, it's discovering what you could have built." The hum of the electric kettle was the only sound in the mess hall. Captain Elijah Monroe stood at the head of the long wooden table, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms as steam began to curl from the spout of the silver device. He glanced at the two Japanese officers standing across from him, Captain Hoshino and Lieutenant Sato, who remained expressionless, their postures rigid and arms folded behind their backs in military formality. "This here," Monroe began, tapping the lid of the humming kettle with his knuckle, "can boil water in under 2 minutes. No fire, no danger, no hassle. You just plug it in and let her do her work." Hoshino offered a nod, polite but unreadable. Sato shifted slightly, casting a glance toward the cord snaking across the floor to a wall outlet. The hiss of water growing hotter inside the kettle filled the silence like an encroaching tide. Monroe smiled, oblivious to the growing tension. "Figured we could show a bit of American hospitality. Tea's a universal language, right?" He turned, reaching for a stack of delicate white cups lined neatly beside a canister of Earl Grey. His hands moved with practiced care, as if he were performing a small ceremony. The men behind him, 2 guards and a mess hall cook, watched curiously, unsure if they were witnessing diplomacy or theater. The kettle clicked. Monroe's smile widened. "There she goes." He poured with exaggerated gentleness, letting the amber stream fill each cup as if expecting reverence. The steam rose between them like a veil. He slid the cups forward. "Gentlemen." From one culture to another, Hoshino bowed slightly and took the cup without a word. Sato followed, his fingers briefly brushing the rim before holding the paper-thin vessel in both hands. Monroe, sensing the formality, took his own seat at the table's head and raised his cup in a loose toast. "To peace, eventual, of course." They didn't drink. Monroe waited a beat, then sipped his tea, clearly satisfied. "My mother used to say this blend could calm even the rowdiest boys at our church." Maybe it works across borders too. Hoshino's lips twitched at the corners, but not from amusement. He turned slightly to Sato and spoke quietly in Japanese. Even their tea is conquered by machines. Sato's mouth tightened into something between a smile and a wince. His eyes flicked toward the kettle again, then to Monroe, who was now obliviously explaining the kettle's automatic shut-off. They believe simplicity makes life better, Hoshino added under his breath. But too much ease dulls the edge. Sato nodded faintly, then brought the cup to his lips but didn't drink. Monroe leaned forward, still animated. Back home, we use this kettle 3, maybe 4 times a day. Mornings before work, evenings before dinner. Even got my brother to use one. He swore by stovetop until he nearly burned his kitchen down. Neither officer responded. A silence thickened between them. Monroe, mistaking it for cultural distance, tried again. I figured since you men come from a tea tradition, you'd appreciate— We do, Hoshino cut in, the first English he'd spoken aloud. His voice was calm, but there was an undertone Monroe didn't catch. Ah, well, good then, Monroe chuckled, raising his cup again. Maybe this'll be one of the few things we agree on. He laughed softly at his own joke. The officers did not. Behind them, one of the guards shifted uncomfortably. The kettle let out a soft pop as it cooled. When the brief gathering ended, the Japanese officers exited in silence, cups untouched, and returned to their barracks. The door shut behind them with a hollow thud. Monroe remained seated for a moment longer, swirling the last of his tea, missing entirely the undercurrent he had just deepened. Later that evening, in the dim yellow light of Barrack D, Hoshino recounted the event to a small group of fellow officers seated cross-legged on the floor. He mimicked Monroe's hand gestures, the way he tapped the kettle like unveiling a national treasure, the exaggerated reverence as he poured steaming water into flimsy white cups. An electric kettle ceremony, Hoshino declared with dry theatricality, earning a few stifled chuckles. Lieutenant Sato added, He spoke of it as if he'd invented fire. Another officer snorted. Next time, he'll show us how to toast bread with lightning. They laughed, but quietly, always mindful of who might be listening. A phrase caught on among the group, passed from lips with smirking disdain. The Americans even need cords to boil water. By morning, the whisper had spread like vapor across the camp. Even younger soldiers, those too junior to understand the cultural undertones, repeated the joke as if it explained everything wrong with the West. Back in the administration office, Monroe wrote in his logbook with content satisfaction. He described the tea exchange as positive, noting the officers' gracious participation and clear interest in American comforts. He left the kettle plugged in for continued use. But as he filed the page into the camp's daily archive, his entry sat atop a widening chasm he couldn't see. For the Japanese officers, the kettle was no longer just a curiosity. It had become a symbol, not of progress, but of distance. A quiet reminder that their world, rigid and ritual-bound, was now brushing against a force that made time its servant and stripped effort from action. And that realization, unspoken and heavy, carried the weight of something deeper than culture, the fear of irrelevance. We thought they were showing off. We didn't see they were showing us the future. Raymond Keller pinched the bridge of his nose and leaned back in his creaking chair. The overhead fan in the intelligence office clacked rhythmically, stirring warm air and dust over his cluttered desk. Stacks of prisoner interrogation summaries, hundreds of pages of mundane camp life and trivial complaints lay before him. He had skimmed through 6 already that morning, each report more monotonous than the last. Hunger, boredom, letters from home, lice, rain. It all bled together, until one line caught his eye. The Japanese laugh at our electric kettles. They think it's magic. Keller frowned, tapping his pen against the margin. The quote came from a German POW assigned to kitchen detail with the newly arrived Japanese internees. The report had been routine, mostly food complaints and observations of cultural differences. But that line struck a nerve, not for its military importance but for its tone. He leaned closer, rereading it slowly. He snorted. "Magic," he muttered aloud, writing a note in the margin with a dry flourish. "Cultural pride, not tactical relevance." Then, without a second thought, he shoved the report into the archive pile on the right side of his desk. Outside, a jeep backfired. Inside, the fan hummed. Keller reached for the next file. Another line of potential insight, filed and forgotten. Half a world away, behind the perimeter fences of Camp Fairfield, Sergeant Tomohei Arai crouched in a dark corner of the barracks utility shed. His hands were blackened with dust and grime, fingertips raw from unscrewing rusted panels. He breathed shallowly, conscious of every creak in the wooden floor above. His heart pounded, not from fear of being caught by American guards, but from the risk of being seen by one of his own. Beneath him lay the fractured shell of an electric kettle, discarded behind the mess hall after the heating element had failed the day before. Arai had waited until nightfall, until the American cleanup crew passed and most of the camp lay quiet in sleep. Only then did he slip out, tools wrapped in cloth beneath his jacket, and pry the broken machine free from the trash. He set the dented base on his lap now, fingers trembling with anticipation. The casing came loose with a crack of surrender. Inside, dust and scorched wiring greeted him, but nestled in the heart of it was the thing he had spent weeks trying to imagine. A copper coil, tightly wound, clean and brilliant even after failure. He stared at it in stunned silence. "So simple," he whispered. He had expected something more. Valves, fuel chambers, a miniature combustion process perhaps. But no, it was elegant, clean. Electricity running through copper, heat flowing like breath. No gears, no fire, no waste. His mind reeled backward to his early engineering days in Yokohama, where innovation had always answered to military demand. The factories built engines for ships, parts for planes, but never anything for comfort. His supervisor had once laughed at a prototype for an electric rice steamer, slapping Arai on the back. "We don't need toys," the man had said. "We need war machines." Arai stared at the coil again. It glowed in his mind like a symbol of everything they'd missed, not because they couldn't build it, but because they were told not to. The floorboards above creaked. Arai froze. The wind rattled a loose pane in the wall. He waited, motionless, for the footsteps to fade. When the silence returned, he carefully folded a torn scrap of paper and sketched the heating layout. His lines were precise, like muscle memory reaching back through time. The copper loop, the ceramic brace, the insulation padding. He turned the base slightly, examining the wiring path, eyes narrowing with a mix of awe and shame. He felt it in his gut. This device, so ordinary to the Americans, was a key. Not to winning the war, no, it was too late for that, but to understanding why they'd lost. The Americans had invested in ease, in efficiency, even in their kitchens. His own side had stripped those ideas down to nothing. Comfort was weakness, they said. Luxury, a distraction. But what if it was actually strategy? Arai gently brushed away a line of dust and saw how the heating plate nestled perfectly within the circular frame. No wasted space. The craftsmanship was industrial, but the intent behind it, that was what haunted him. Someone had wanted soldiers and workers to have hot water in minutes, not as indulgence, but as necessity. That mindset alone separated them. Thousands of miles away, Keller sat slouched in his chair, tossing a pencil end over end toward a cup. He missed again. The file with the Kettle quote remained untouched in the archive bin, its potential implications lost beneath layers of routine. A typing clerk passed behind him, dropping another bundle of reports on his desk. Keller groaned. More kitchen talk. The clerk shrugged. Mostly. A few notes from the Red Cross visit, a funny one about socks. Keller rubbed his face and muttered, If socks win the war, I'll eat my boots. Back at Camp Fairfield, Arai carefully placed the coil back into the base and wrapped the entire kettle in a threadbare towel. He pushed it under the storage shelf, away from curious eyes. He didn't know what he would do with it yet, but he knew it mattered. Later that night, he stared at the ceiling of his bunk. Around him, his comrades snored or whispered quietly, talking about family or the weather. But Arai's mind raced, not with invention, but with loss. They had laughed at the kettle. They had mocked its hum, its hiss, the speed with which it boiled water. They had called it a metal demon. But demons didn't make life easier. They didn't save time, or burns, or lives. He clenched his fists beneath the blanket, guilt rising in his throat like bile. Somewhere across the camp, the Americans boiled water in clean silence. No firewood, no waste, no shame. And, far beyond the fences, men like Keller continued filing away truths they didn't yet understand. Not because they were blind, but because they didn't think they needed to look. When the enemy laughs at your tools, they've already dismissed the lessons they carry. The first scream tore through the camp just after morning roll call. Fire. The mess hall's southern wall flickered with orange light as smoke curled violently from the eaves. In the cramped barracks nearby, men shouted in fractured Japanese and German, boots thudding against wooden floors. Private Masaru Naito was already halfway to the source when the acrid sting hit his eyes. Inside the kitchen, flames licked the rafters, fed by a grease-slicked stovetop that hissed and cracked. A pot of oil had tipped, no one was sure how, and caught the open flame beneath it. Someone shouted, "Water! Buckets!" But panic blurred language. Buckets clattered, feet slipped, orders tangled. German POWs moved swiftly. One unplugged the electric food warmer without hesitation and shoved it aside. Another tossed a wet towel over the radio, shielding it from sparks. They didn't wait for instruction. Years of factory labor and exposure to American utilities had left them oddly prepared. But the Japanese prisoners froze. Corporal Itsuki Hiro, desperate to help, lunged toward the counter and gripped the kettle's wire, assuming it was a lifeline to be flung aside. The searing shock jolted through his arm. He screamed, a brutal, raw cry that silenced the nearby chaos. The scent of burned flesh mingled with smoke. He dropped to his knees, clutching his palm, eyes wide and unfocused. The kettle remained, humming gently, its cord still secure in the wall. Another prisoner, Yutaka Senda, twisted a faucet handle to fill a basin but recoiled when the water surged with unexpected force. The pressure caught him off guard, splashing his legs and nearly toppling him backward. In his island village, such water came slowly, if at all. Now he stood soaked and ashamed, watching the others struggle with machines that obeyed foreign logic. The guards eventually got the fire under control, aided more by the Germans' calm reactions than any coordinated protocol. No one died, but 4 Japanese men were treated for burns, none directly from the fire itself. That night, silence hung over Barracks C like a fog thicker than any smoke. Bandages glowed pale under the dim light bulbs. Sergeant Arai scribbled quietly in his corner, expression taut, eyes darting to the humming metal box in the room's center. No one laughed anymore. Captain Hoshino stood before them, arms folded tightly, voice low but cutting. "We failed today. Not because of weakness, but because we refused to learn." He paused, letting his words land. Every man looked at the kettle now, not with mockery, but with recognition. "We must stop laughing. We must start learning," he said, lifting his chin and pointing to the blistered cloth wrapped around Corporal Hero's hand. His tone held no anger, only resolve. In the corner, the electric kettle clicked gently as it finished another boil. Steam rose like a whisper in the quiet. Mockery makes poor armor against the heat of truth. The kettle hissed softly as the water inside reached a rolling boil. Lieutenant Sato stood motionless beside the table, one hand resting near the plug socket as if for reassurance. The thin cord snaked across the surface toward the squat metal kettle, an American design, still faintly scratched from years of camp use. Its quiet hum seemed louder than the shuffling boots and murmured voices around him. Every eye in the mess hall was fixed on him. Every breath seemed to pause. Sato inhaled. His throat was dry, and the tongue of his stiff English twisted in his mouth. But he bowed anyway, sharp, precise, trained. Then he spoke. "This is American Electric Kettle," he began, voice strained but clear. "It boil water fast, with copper inside. Heat coil, simple design. A few men in the front rows, American guards and Red Cross officials, nodded politely. Others looked mildly amused. Some of the German POWs, seated quietly in back rows, leaned forward, intrigued. But among the Japanese prisoners gathered at the edges, a different tension lingered, a mix of disbelief and pride reluctant to show its face. Sato reached for the thin ceramic handle, lifted the lid slightly to reveal the steaming interior, then carefully returned it to place. "This," he continued, pausing for the word, "not magic. Just engineering." Captain Elijah Monroe, standing off to the side with arms folded and brow raised, blinked slowly. He had seen this exact kettle ridiculed, mishandled, even burned over months of misunderstanding. Now, one of the very men who had once smirked at it stood before him, explaining its function as if it were a shrine. A few weeks ago, the idea of a Japanese officer giving any sort of demonstration, let alone about an American device, would have been dismissed outright. But since the armistice, the air inside Camp Fairfield had shifted. War had ended. Orders were quieter now, schedules lighter. Even fear itself seemed dulled. In this strange in-between time, someone, no one knew who, had suggested a cultural exchange presentation. A few harmless demonstrations, shared food perhaps, something to show the Red Cross that prisoners were being prepared for reintegration. Sato, unexpectedly, had volunteered. He now retrieved 2 small cups, one white porcelain, the other made crudely from folded metal, and poured from the kettle with slow, deliberate movement. Steam curled upward, glistening in the beam of light from a window pane. He had steeped green tea in the base earlier. The color wasn't perfect, too pale, too weak by Tokyo standards, but the smell was warm, sharp, earthy. He handed the first cup to Captain Monroe, who accepted it awkwardly, nodding. The second he placed carefully in front of the table, as if for an invisible guest. Behind him, Sergeant Tomohei Arai watched in silence, arms crossed over his chest. His uniform was worn thin at the sleeves, his hands still calloused from weeks of handling scrap metal. Inside his mattress, tucked beneath the lining, lay carefully sketched circuit diagrams, pages he had redrawn from memory, tested against the discarded baseplate of a broken American kettle he'd salvaged months ago. Pages he would not leave behind. After Sato concluded his speech, there was a brief, uncertain pause. Then a smattering of polite applause, claps from officers, a few from the Red Cross observers. Captain Monroe stepped forward with a slight grin. "That was quite something, Lieutenant," he said. "Never thought I'd see one of you explain a Yankee kettle better than our own guys." Sato gave a modest bow. "We learn." Sometimes, slowly, there was laughter then. Not mocking, not bitter, just quiet amusement. And something else beneath it. Respect, maybe. Monroe gave a final nod and stepped away. Later that evening, in a small, dimly lit room near the administrative offices, Sergeant Arai stood in front of a folding table with his repatriation papers spread before him. The Red Cross representative, a balding American with wire-frame glasses named Mr. Emmett, glanced up after skimming the top page. "You're requesting to take home kettle parts?" he asked, mildly confused. Arai nodded. "And sketches." "All personal, no danger. Education." Mr. Emmett tapped the form. "Says here you're an electrical engineer." "I was," Arai replied, eyes steady. I will be again. After Emmett leaned back. Why the kettle? Why not a book or something less ordinary? Arai hesitated, then replied with quiet certainty. Because no one in Japan will believe a pot can teach you to win peace. Emmett blinked, then signed the page without further comment. A week later, Arai left Camp Fairfield with only 2 bundles of paper and a small crate of salvaged parts. The war was over, but the hunger had only begun. Cities lay dark and broken. But in a dusty corner of a Nagoya warehouse, Arai partnered with a cousin who had once tinkered with radio kits. Together, they soldered, tested, failed, adjusted, and tried again. Over time, a new version emerged. Smaller, safer, faster. It bore no American markings, no military serials. Just clean steel, a copper coil, and a small paper tag. Years later, that model would quietly enter Japanese homes, schools, and barracks. Few would remember the war. Fewer still the camp, but one man would always remember the first time it hissed in silence and did not laugh. Sometimes, the tool you once mocked becomes the tool that remakes your world. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of culture shock, technological wonder, and how ignorance can turn to awe through discovery. Its purpose is to inspire curiosity, appreciation for progress, and understanding across cultures even in the midst of conflict.